All right, let's dive into something pretty incredible. We're talking about a legal framework that is truly one of a kind, a whole system for justice and human rights built by an entire continent for itself. I mean, think about that. Born from the tough realities of colonialism and conflict, this is the story of the African human rights system. So, yeah, that is a huge question, right? How do you even begin to do that? We're not just talking about writing down some laws. Nope. This is about building real institutions, fostering trust, and getting dozens and dozens of incredibly diverse nations to share a single vision. And that question, well, that's really the heart of what we're going to unpack today. Okay, to really get why this system even exists, you have to go back in time. You have to feel the urgency of that post-independence era. It was this incredible mix of hope and, frankly, some really deep-seated challenges. The existing global rules, the international frameworks, they just weren't cut out for Africa's unique situation. The continent absolutely had to forge its own path. And look, the scale of the problems was just staggering. We're talking about the deep, deep scars left by colonialism, the absolute brutality of apartheid, the rise of military dictatorships, devastating ethnic conflicts. And on top of all of that, you had this crushing, widespread poverty. These weren't just abstract legal issues you'd read about in a textbook. No, this was the daily reality for millions of people. It demanded a solution that was authentically and uniquely African. So right out of that intense struggle, a totally new path was created. And what's so important here is that African leaders and legal minds didn't just, copy and paste a Western model. Not at all. They made a very deliberate choice to come together and build something brand new. A system that was tailor-made for the continent's own history, its own values. And this is what they came up with. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights. You'll also hear it called the Banjul Charter. It was adopted back in 1981, and you've got to understand, this wasn't just another piece of paper, another treaty to sign. It was way more than that. It was essentially the constitution for a whole new era of human rights in Africa. And, of course, something this big doesn't just appear out of thin air. It was shaped by real visionaries, people like Kiba Mbai from Senegal, who's often called its chief architect. He and his colleagues were the ones who really infused the charter with this focus on African values. And that meant thinking beyond just the individual. It meant thinking about the community, about the people as a whole. Building this whole thing was definitely a marathon, not a sprint. The charter itself was adopted in 81, but then it took 5 whole years for it to even come into force. Then, in 87, the commission was set up to kind of monitor and promote rights. But it wasn't until 2004, think about that, decades later, that the court was finally established, giving the system some real, actual teeth. Okay, so we've got the backstory, right? We have the founding document, we have a timeline, but what does the system actually look like today? How does it all work? Who's running the show, and what exactly do they do? Let's get into the nuts and bolts of it. First off, just think about the sheer scale of this thing. 54. That's the number of African nations that have signed on to the charter. I mean, that's practically the entire continent standing united behind this one framework. It makes it one of the most widely accepted regional human rights systems anywhere in the world. That's a huge deal. So the whole system really rests on 2 main pillars. Think of it like a 1-2 punch. First, over in Banjul, you've got the African Commission. They're like the investigators, the promoters. They monitor what's happening and look into complaints. Then you've got the heavy hitter in Arusha, the African Court. They're the judge. They issue legally binding decisions and can order reparations. Together, they're this powerful duo designed to protect and enforce rights. Look, a system like this can look great on paper, but it's only as good as its actual impact on the ground, right? So the real question is, has it actually made a difference in people's lives? Well, let's take a look at some of the victories and really dig into what makes this system so unique. Okay, this is where things get really interesting. This is what makes the African Charter a real game changer. You see, a lot of Western models focus almost entirely on the individual, but the African system introduces this groundbreaking idea of people's rights. That's the collective right of an entire community to things like development, their own natural resources, a healthy environment. And get this, it even talks about the duties that individuals have to their community. That's a powerful statement about African communitarian values. And believe me, these aren't just abstract ideas. These principles have led to some major real-world wins. The system was a key tool in the global fight against apartheid. It gave us the Maputo Protocol, which is genuinely one of the most progressive documents on women's rights in the entire world. It's been used to secure land for indigenous communities, to empower NGOs so they can actually challenge governments, and it even set up protections for children that are stricter than the global UN standards. That's impact. Let me give you a concrete example, the Ojiet case in Kenya. This was not some dusty legal footnote. For the Ojiet people, this ruling from the African court was absolutely life-changing. It was a powerful, official affirmation of their right to live on their ancestral lands, to preserve their culture. It's a perfect example of how this system can deliver real justice for communities that have been pushed to the margins. But of course, no system is perfect, right? It's been working for decades now, so it's super important to take a step back and have an honest look at where things stand today. We need to see its incredible strengths, but also its very real struggles, and what all that means for the future. And when you look closely, its reality is really a story of two sides. On the one hand, you have this widely accepted system, an active court, and amazing participation from civil society. That's the good news. But on the other side, well, it faces some huge challenges. We're talking about governments that just flat out ignore the court's rulings, political pushback, and the constant pressure of ongoing conflicts and not enough money to go around. So, what's the path forward? Well, it really boils down to a few key priorities. First and foremost, you've got to strengthen the court's authority and, crucially, create better ways to actually enforce its decisions. That has to happen alongside efforts to deepen democracy and the rule of law across the continent. And all the while, the system has to adapt to brand new challenges, things like digital rights and migration that weren't even on the radar back in 1981. And all of this brings us right back to that huge question we started with, but now we see it with a bit more clarity. The entire African human rights system was born from this incredibly powerful idea of unity. But its greatest test, the thing it's up against every single day, is this. Can that founding vision of solidarity actually overcome the deep divisions, the political self-interest, and the conflicts that still challenge the continent today? The answer to that question? Well, it's going to define the future of human rights for millions and millions of people.